The rain hammered against the cobblestones of occupied Prague like bullets from a machine gun. Fitting, somehow, for a city that had learned to measure time in occupation, rather than seasons. I pressed myself deeper into the doorway of the abandoned bakery, my thin coat offering almost no protection against the November cold that cut through the fabric like a knife through butter. My name is Klara Kovac, and I was about to make a choice that would either save my family or destroy everything I'd fought to protect. The German patrols had intensified that week. Word spread through the underground network like wildfire. The Gestapo was hunting someone specific, and they weren't being subtle about it. Checkpoints appeared on every corner. Papers were demanded with brutal efficiency. I'd managed to avoid them so far by moving through the city's veins, the back alleys, the cellars, the forgotten passages that connected one safe house to another. But my luck was a reservoir running dry, and I could feel it. I clutched the envelope against my chest, feeling the thickness of the documents inside. Extraction routes, names of resistance members, locations of supply caches. This envelope was worth more than gold, more than my life, certainly. It was worth the lives of everyone I loved. That's why I had to get it out of the city before the Gestapo's nets closed completely. The American patrols had started appearing 3 days ago, tentative at first, probing the eastern edges of the city as the Soviet advance pushed closer from the other direction. The Nazis were being squeezed, and in their panic, they were making mistakes. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and give it a like. It helps me keep bringing you stories this good. Let's go. I heard the trucks before I saw them. Heavy diesel engines, American-made, growling through the narrow street. I held my breath, pressing myself flatter against the damp brick. Through the veil of rain, I watched as the convoy pulled to a stop 50 meters away. Soldiers began dismounting. American GIs, their uniforms damp and their faces alert, but not hostile. They were establishing a checkpoint, methodical and professional. Nothing like the theatrical brutality of the German occupation forces. This was my moment. Everyone in the resistance knew that the Allies were America's allies only until the war ended. After that, the Soviets and Americans would carve up Europe like hunters dividing a kill. But for now, in this narrow window of time, the Americans might be persuaded to help extract someone, especially someone carrying intelligence that could accelerate the liberation of Prague. I waited until the soldiers had finished setting up their barrier, until their attention was divided between the street ahead and the paperwork they were beginning to organize. Then I stepped out of the doorway, letting the rain soak through my coat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. The soldier who noticed me first was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. There was something about him that made my heart skip, not from fear, but from a recognition I couldn't quite name. He moved toward me with the kind of authority that suggested he was the officer in charge, his uniform immaculate despite the weather. "Papers," he said, his English clear but not unkind. I handed them over, my fingers steady even as my mind raced. The documents were forged, excellent forgeries made by a specialist in the underground, but they would hold up to cursory inspection. Only if they ran them against the German registry would they begin to crumble. He studied my face longer than my papers, and I felt something shift between us. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. A spark, a question, a possibility. "Your name is Klara Kovac," he said, reading from the document. "Czech national, registered in this district." "Yes," I said, meeting his eyes. "I'm trying to get to the Red Cross station on Nerudova Street. My mother is ill." It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie. The Red Cross station was in the opposite direction from where I needed to go, but it would explain my presence near the checkpoint without raising suspicion. Sick relatives were something even German soldiers understood, had learned to expect in a city slowly starving under occupation. The officer, I could see his name tag now, Commander Harrison, handed my papers back to me, but instead of waving me through, he took a step closer, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear it. "You're lying," he said, not accusingly, but almost gently. "And you're carrying something you shouldn't be. I can see it in how you're holding yourself, how you're protecting your left side." My blood turned to ice. This was it. This was the moment where everything could fall apart. But then he did something that changed everything. He smiled, not mockingly, but with a kind of sad understanding. and he said something that would echo in my mind for the rest of the war, and long after. Whatever you're carrying, whoever you're fighting for, it matters more than you think, but you're not making it to wherever you're going dressed like that, carrying yourself like that. You'll be stopped within 2 blocks, and those documents won't hold. I opened my mouth to protest, but he continued, I'm going to let you through, and I'm going to need you to trust me, even though every instinct you have is screaming not to, because I didn't become a commander by being blind to what matters. And what matters right now isn't policy or orders, or even the Geneva Convention. What matters is getting you to safety. The way Commander James Harrison moved through the occupied city was like watching a man fluent in a language the rest of us were still struggling to learn. We had left the checkpoint in a Jeep 15 minutes earlier, and he had driven with the kind of casual authority that came from knowing exactly where the German patrols were, and where they weren't. I sat beside him in the passenger seat, my body rigid with tension, the envelope still pressed against my ribs under 3 layers of clothing. You're wondering why I'm helping you, he said. It wasn't a question. He didn't take his eyes off the street as he navigated a particularly narrow alley, his American accent cutting through the gray afternoon like something bright and dangerous. I'm wondering if this is a trap, I answered honestly. Lying to him seemed pointless now. He'd already seen through my first deception with the casual ease of someone who'd learned to read people the way soldiers read maps. He laughed. A real laugh. Not bitter or mocking, but genuinely amused. A trap? Clara, if I wanted to arrest you, I could have done it back at the checkpoint with a lot less trouble. No, this isn't a trap. He glanced at me briefly, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. This is a calculated risk, and I'm hoping you're worth the court-martial I'll probably face if this goes sideways. The casual way he said court-martial made me realize that he was risking far more than I'd initially understood. An American officer helping a Czech civilian, a woman carrying what were clearly underground documents, wasn't just against protocol. It was treason, or close enough to it. Why? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, navigating another turn, his hands steady on the wheel. The Jeep was military, American, instantly recognizable, and yet somehow it gave us cover. The German soldiers and collaborators who saw us simply waved us through, assuming that an American officer knew where he was going and had every right to be there. Because I lost someone, he finally said. In Paris. French resistance fighter. Smart woman, brave woman. She was trying to do something that mattered, and the Nazis caught her before I could get her out. He swallowed hard, and I watched the muscles of his jaw tighten. I'm not going to let that happen again. Not if I can help it. The pain in his voice was real, and I felt something shift inside me. This man wasn't a naive American playing soldier. He was someone who'd already paid the price of caring too much. We arrived at a safe house in the Vinerati district 15 minutes later, a nondescript apartment building that looked like 1,000 others in the city. He parked the Jeep in an alley behind the building and led me through a service entrance that didn't appear on any official map of the property. The corridors inside were dim and cool, and they smelled like dust and old books. At the 3rd door on the left, we stopped. Commander Harrison knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times. The door opened a crack, and I saw the weathered face of an older man I recognized immediately, Franz Novotny, one of the most active members of the Prague resistance. She's with me, Harrison said simply. Franz's eyes widened with recognition, both of the American and of me, and he opened the door fully. Inside, the apartment was warm and hummed with quiet activity. At least a dozen people were present, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a well-organized underground network. Maps covered one wall. A radio transmission equipment occupied a corner desk. I could see the careful architecture of a major resistance hub. You know who she is? Franz asked, speaking in Czech. No, Harrison admitted, but I know she's important, and I know she needs to get out of Prague. Franz studied the American for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She's one of ours. Has been for 2 years. If she's been compromised, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She hasn't been, I said quietly in Czech. Then I switched to English for the commander's benefit. At least not yet, but the net is tightening. The Gestapo is looking for anyone connected to the latest supply drops. This envelope contains everything. Names, locations, schedules. It has to get to the Allies. Then that's exactly what's going to happen, Harrison said. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that Commander Harrison wasn't working alone in his decision to help me. He had contacts throughout the military hierarchy, connections that stretched back to OSS intelligence networks, relationships built on the shared understanding that sometimes following orders meant missing opportunities to do the right thing. He spent the next several hours in the safe house, going through the documents in the envelope with Franz and the other resistance members. I watched him work, and I began to understand that there was far more to James Harrison than the uniform suggested. He understood Czech politics. He knew the names and histories of resistance operatives across Central Europe. He'd clearly been training for intelligence work before he'd been assigned to the military checkpoint. "This is comprehensive," he said finally, looking through the last stack of photographs. "These supply caches, these contact information sheets, these tactical assessments. This could accelerate the Soviet advance by weeks, maybe months. The Gestapo was right to be hunting for this." "Which means they'll keep hunting," Franz said grimly. "And everyone connected to its creation. And transfer is in danger." "Not if we get Clara out tonight," Harrison said. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd entered the safe house, and I felt that same spark I'd felt at the checkpoint, more intense now, complicated by everything that had happened between us and everything that still lay ahead. "There's an extraction route through the mountains," he said. "It's used for Allied pilots who've been shot down. We get you to a contact point in the Bohemian forest, and from there, you're in friendly territory. The Soviets are advancing from the east, which means you can move north toward the American lines or east toward the Russians, depending on what you prefer." "What do you mean, we?" I asked carefully. "I mean I'm going with you," he said simply. "Because sending you with a guide would raise too many questions." "But sending you with an American officer? That's just military operations. Standard procedure." Franz made a noise of protest. "You can't leave your post." "I'm taking a personal leave," Harrison interrupted smoothly. "Medical issue. Very sensitive. My second-in-command can handle the checkpoint for a few days. By the time anyone questions why I'm gone, we'll be long gone." The audacity of it took my breath away. This man was burning his career, his safety, possibly his life, for someone he'd known for less than 2 hours. I should have been more careful. I should have been more suspicious. Good people didn't take risks like that without a reason, and if his reason was simply the memory of someone he'd lost, that meant he was vulnerable. That meant he could be hurt again. But I also knew that I couldn't make it out of Prague alone, not with the Gestapo hunting, not with the noose tightening around the neck of the resistance. I needed help, and this man, this stranger who'd seen through my lies, was offering it. "When do we leave?" I asked. "The mountains of Bohemia in November are unforgiving, a landscape of granite and pine where winter stakes its claim early and holds it late into spring." Commander Harrison had acquired travel papers with frightening ease, and we left Prague at dusk in a covered truck that belonged, officially, to the American Military Supply Corps. The driver was a Sergeant Martinez, who asked no questions, and apparently knew how to navigate the back roads of occupied Czechoslovakia better than the actual map suggested. I sat beside Harrison in the cab of the truck, my body aching from the tension of constant vigilance. We'd been on the road for 3 hours, and the city had gradually given way to forests, forests to foothills, foothills to the sharp spines of the mountains themselves. "Tell me about yourself," Harrison said as he drove. It was the kind of casual question that masked something deeper, a need to know who he was risking everything for, and more importantly, what kind of person he was becoming by making that risk. "There's not much to tell," I said, watching the dark landscape roll past. "I was a teacher before the occupation. German language and literature, of all the cruel ironies. When the Nazis came, I watched them dismantle everything I believed in. I joined the resistance because it was the only sane response to insanity. Your family? My mother in Prague, my brother in the forced labor camps. My father died when I was 17. I paused, before the war, when things were still normal, back when I thought I knew what suffering was." Harrison's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "My father died too. I was 14. Heart attack. He never got to see me graduate, never got to see me become what I wanted to be." "Which was?" I asked. "A musician," he said, surprising me. "I was training to be a concert pianist before the war. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly everything changed. The draft was inevitable. My mother begged me to try for conscientious objector status, but I couldn't do it. How could I sit safe at home while people died? So I enlisted, and the army discovered I had an aptitude for languages and strategy. And he gestured at the landscape rolling past. Here I am, teaching an American officer how to navigate occupied territory. You're not my teacher, I said carefully. We're navigating it together. He glanced at me, and I saw something shift in his expression, something dangerous and tender at the same time. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? I'm not sure, he admitted. Someone more frightened, maybe. Someone broken by what they've had to endure. But you're not broken, Clara. He trailed off, searching for the words. Surviving? I offered. Defiant, he corrected. You're defiant. Even now, even carrying those documents, knowing the danger, you're not broken. That's rarer than you'd think. We stopped for the night at a small farmhouse about 15 kilometers from the main road. The farmer who owned it, an older man named Václav, had clearly worked with the underground before. He asked no questions, simply showed us to a small room on the second floor with a single window overlooking the dark valley below. Sergeant Martinez slept in the barn with the truck. I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The constant vigilance, the fear, the weight of the documents I'd been carrying, the impossible kindness of this American stranger, it had all accumulated into something that felt like drowning in slow motion. Harrison insisted that I sleep first while he kept watch. I tried to argue, but he was immovable. That's an order, he said, with just enough of a smile to soften the authority in his voice. I fell asleep within minutes, only to wake hours later with a nightmare clawing at my throat. I'd dreamed of the Gestapo, of interrogation rooms, of the kind of pain that erases everything you are and leaves only agony. My gasp woke Harrison, who'd been sitting in the corner of the room, alert even in rest. He came to me without hesitation, sitting on the edge of the bed. You're safe, he said. You're safe here. I've got you. I didn't stop him when he reached out and took my hand. I needed that anchor to reality, that connection to someone who wasn't part of the nightmare machinery of occupation. We sat in silence for a long time, his hand warm around mine, and gradually my heartbeat slowed. Tell me something good, I finally said. Tell me about before the war, about your music. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I played at my high school's final concert before I graduated. Bach, the Prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. My mother cried. My father was already sick by then, but he sat in the front row, and when I finished, he stood up and applauded even though the effort made him pale. He paused. I haven't touched a piano since I enlisted. Why not? Because touching a piano means admitting that there's a world beyond this war. And I've learned that allowing myself to hope for that kind of future makes it harder to do what needs to be done in the present. I understood that perfectly. It was the same calculation I'd made 2 years ago when I'd decided to truly commit to the resistance. The same sacrifice. When this is over, I said quietly, you should play again. You should play for everyone who died waiting for freedom. You should play for those of us who survived. He looked at me in the darkness, and I saw something in his eyes that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. It was the beginning of love, or at least the dangerous recognition that we could love each other, if we lived long enough to make the attempt. Only if you're there to listen, he said. We didn't kiss. We didn't cross that threshold. But we came close enough that I could feel the weight of choice hanging between us. The choice to maintain the distance necessary to survive, or to admit that we'd already crossed into something deeper than either of us had planned for. Before the night ended, he told me more about his family, about his dreams of Paris before the war, about the French resistance fighter he'd mentioned in the Jeep, a woman named Sophie who'd been a pianist too, ironically enough. She'd died in a Gestapo interrogation in 1942, and he'd been carrying that guilt like a stone in his chest ever since. I need you to know that I'm not saving you because I'm a good person, he said. I'm saving you because I couldn't save her, because I'm haunted by the fact that I had the power to do something and didn't act fast enough. That's not why you're saving me, I said gently. If it was, you would have moved on to the next person by now. You're saving me because you see something in me worth saving, and that's what matters. If you're loving this story as much as I am, please comment below. Tell me what you think Clara and Commander Harrison will face next. Your comments keep stories like this alive. By the time we reached the extraction point the next evening, a clearing deep in the Bohemian forest, marked by 3 white stones arranged in a triangle, I had fallen in love with James Harrison, in that slow, inexorable way that happens when two people recognize something in each other that they've been searching for all their lives. The extraction point looked like any other clearing in the vast Bohemian forest. Unremarkable, forgettable, exactly as it should be. 3 white stones arranged in a triangle, just as Harrison had described. Ancient pines surrounded us, their branches heavy with snow that had fallen overnight, transforming the landscape into something that looked less like a war-torn Czechoslovakia and more like a fairy tale. Only fairy tales didn't include the constant low-level hum of military operations 3 kilometers away, German troops retreating eastward, away from the advancing Soviet forces, creating a narrow window of chaos in which certain extractions could happen. "We wait here," Harrison said, checking his watch. "The contact should arrive within the hour. They'll have papers for you. New identity, new story. Once you get to the American lines, there are people waiting who know how to move you farther west." We'd left the truck with Sergeant Martinez at a small village called Rozhnov 2 hours earlier. Martinez had saluted sharply when Harrison had explained where we were going, and I realized that the sergeant had known all along exactly what this journey really was. He'd been part of the operation from the beginning, just as much a co-conspirator in whatever unauthorized rescue mission this had become. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who'd spent 2 years working in the shadows of occupation, now being extracted by the American military through what appeared to be official channels. Somewhere, orders were being written, reports were being filed, and a fiction was being maintained that Commander James Harrison was exactly where he was supposed to be. "You're quiet," Harrison observed. He'd removed his uniform jacket and sat beside me on a fallen log, his shirt damp from snow and exertion. "Having regrets? About being rescued?" I asked. "No, about leaving Prague. Leaving my family, leaving the work. Yes, but not about being rescued. Not about this." He turned to look at me, and I saw the question forming in his eyes. The same question that had been building between us since the moment he'd dropped the pretense at the checkpoint and offered me help instead of arrest. "Clara," he began. The gunshot cut off whatever he was about to say. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply sat there, processing the sound. A single shot, distant but clear, echoing off the granite faces of the mountains surrounding us. Then another shot, closer this time, and we were both moving. Harrison pulled me behind the log, just as the trees came alive with movement. German soldiers, at least a dozen, emerging from the forest with methodical precision. They had us surrounded, had probably been tracking us since we'd left the main road. "Damn," Harrison breathed, drawing his service pistol. "They must have been monitoring the military channels. Someone figured out where we were going." "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "We fight," he said simply. "Or we run. But if we run, they'll track us. The only way out of this is through them or—" A new sound interrupted him. Engines, not German, but American. A half-track came roaring through the forest, its machine gun already chattering, laying down suppressive fire in a perfect arc that forced the German soldiers to take cover. Behind the half-track came another vehicle, this one carrying what looked like a full squad of American infantry. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening. Then I realized someone had called in support. Someone had known exactly where we were and what we needed. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. The German soldiers, caught between advancing Russian forces to the east and American positions to the north, weren't interested in a prolonged engagement. They broke and ran, melting back into the forest as quickly as they'd emerged. The American half-track came to a stop beside us, and an officer leaned out. I recognized him immediately. Colonel Michael Stevens, the head of OSS operations in Central Europe. He looked down at Harrison with an expression that mixed exasperation with something that might have been respect. "Commander Harrison," Stevens said, "I should have you court-martialed for this stunt. Instead, I'm going to officially assign you to a deep-cover intelligence operation in Austria. Your record will show that you've been there for 3 days. In reality, you'll be helping Ms. Kovacs here reach Switzerland, and Allied intelligence can decide what to do with her after that." I stared at both of them. "You knew?" I asked Stevens. "You knew what was happening?" "Of course I knew," Stevens said, with a slight smile. "Did you think Commander Harrison was operating independently?" "No, this was sanctioned. Technically, anyway. There are certain operations that succeed by maintaining a useful distance from official channels. Getting critical intelligence out of occupied territory while maintaining plausible deniability, is one of them. You carry documents that suggest German movements, Soviet intentions, and internal resistance capability assessments. That makes you valuable. That makes you worth bending some rules for. Harrison helped me to my feet, and I noticed his hand trembling slightly. The adrenaline crash, I realized. The knowledge that we'd survived something that should have killed us. The extraction route changes, Stevens continued. You're not going northwest anymore. There's a safe house in the mountains about 5 kilometers from here. You'll stay there for 2 days while we arrange new transportation. After that, you'll head south toward Italy. The lines are fluid in that region, and we have assets that can move you across them. What about my family? I asked. My mother in Prague? My brother in the camps? Stevens's expression shifted, became more serious. We're working on locating your brother. The camp records are incomplete, but we have names being tracked through channels. Your mother, we can keep her safe through the underground networks in Prague. The city will fall to the Russians within weeks. She'll be safer under Soviet occupation than she would be as a visible collaborator with American forces. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was honest. And in the cold calculus of war, honesty is often all you can ask for. The safe house in the mountains was hidden in a small stone cottage that appeared to date from the 19th century. A local caretaker, an older woman named Petra who spoke no English but understood the necessities of war, provided us with hot food, dry clothes, and the kind of privacy that felt almost transgressive after weeks of constant vigilance. That first night in the safe house, Harrison and I finally crossed the threshold that had been building between us since the moment he'd seen through my initial lie. We didn't have words for what was happening. Not in the context of war, not in the context of the way we'd met, not in the context of an uncertain future where I would likely never see my homeland again. We simply recognized in each other a need that went beyond safety or strategy, or even the practical necessities of survival. We made love in front of a fire that Petra had built for us, on a bed that smelled like ancient linen and the distant memory of peace. And for those hours, we were neither soldier nor resistance fighter, neither occupier nor occupied. We were simply two people who'd found each other in the chaos and had decided that what we felt was worth the risk. I love you, he said afterward, holding me in the darkness. I don't know how long we have, and I don't know what comes next, but I know that I love you. And that's the truest thing I've felt since this war started. I love you too, I said, and it was true. The second day at the safe house brought with it a different kind of storm, not the immediate adrenaline-fueled crisis of combat or capture, but something slower and more corrosive, the weight of consequences, the moral calculus of survival, and the inescapable reality that heroism and betrayal are often two sides of the same coin. In the morning, after Petra brought us bread and coffee, a radio operator arrived with a message from Colonel Stevens. He was a young man, barely 20, who handed us a sealed envelope and then set up a portable radio in the corner of the cottage. Before he left, he told us something that changed everything. The officer who was temporarily replacing Commander Harrison at the checkpoint, the radio operator said carefully. Well, he let through a transport that the Germans had flagged as suspicious. 14 political prisoners. They were executed this morning at Rusin prison. The Nazi command has ordered an investigation, and there's talk of collaboration. They're blaming the American oversight, claiming that your government is smuggling intelligence assets out of the territory. I watched Harrison's face as he received this information, and I saw the moment the weight of his choices settled on him fully. He'd known, intellectually, that his decision to help me would have consequences. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it are vastly different things. Are they going to know it was me? He asked quietly. The officers at the checkpoint, will they figure out that I orchestrated the gaps in the security that allowed Clara through? Possibly, the radio operator said. But your record is clean, and officially you're in Austria working counterintelligence, even if they suspect. Proving it will be difficult. After the operator left, Harrison sat in silence for nearly an hour. I didn't try to comfort him or offer words that would deflect from what had happened. 14 people were dead because of the gap he'd created in security. That was the price of my extraction. That was the weight he would carry. I could go back, I said finally. I could present myself to the German command. If I explained that I forced you— No, he said immediately. No, you don't do that. You don't give your life to make my conscience feel better. That's not how this works. But those people were already marked for death, he said, his voice hard. The Nazis didn't execute them because someone broke security. They executed them because the Nazis execute people. The only difference is timing. And if presenting yourself would actually save anyone, I'd tell you to do it. But it won't. It will just add your death to the list. He was right, and I hated him for being right. Because moral logic in wartime is a labyrinth where all the exits lead inward, where every choice costs something, and where survival itself becomes an act of betrayal against those who didn't survive. This is the part they don't tell you about war, Harrison said, standing and walking to the window. Beyond it, the mountains looked peaceful, untouched by the chaos of human conflict. They tell you about courage and heroism. They tell you about sacrifice. But they don't tell you about the moment when you realize that survival requires you to step on other people, that freedom, for some, means death for others. What are you going to do? I asked. My job, he said simply. What I'm trained to do. After the war, I'll try to understand it. I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to understand it. But right now, in this moment, I'm going to make sure your extraction succeeds. I'm going to make sure that those 14 people's deaths weren't pointless. And the way I do that is by making sure that the intelligence you carry helps end this war faster, saves more lives than it costs. He turned to look at me directly. That's how you balance the scales, Clara. You don't do it through guilt or through self-sacrifice. You do it through action, through living, through making sure that what died for your freedom gets used properly. It was a dangerous philosophy, and I recognized it as such. It was the kind of thinking that justified atrocities, that allowed soldiers and resistance fighters and anyone caught in the machinery of war to compartmentalize their choices. But it was also the only way to survive with your sanity intact. That afternoon, the radio operator returned with new orders. We were to move south within 12 hours. The British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, had arranged for a specialized extraction team to meet us at a waypoint near the Moravian border. From there, we'd follow an underground railway that had been moving resistance fighters, intelligence operatives, and political prisoners south toward Italy for the past 2 years. But before we left, Colonel Stevens' message included something else. A detailed intelligence file on a German officer named Klaus Richter, who had been stationed in Prague and who had personally overseen the execution of 17 resistance members in the past 6 months. The file included information about his movements, his routines, his weaknesses. The implication was clear without being stated. Colonel Stevens was giving us the opportunity to do something about Klaus Richter. He was giving us the chance to balance the scales ourselves. I watched Harrison read the file, watched the struggle play out across his face. This was the moment where he would have to decide whether he was still a soldier following orders, or whether he'd become something else, a hunter, someone willing to step outside the rules that govern the conflict. We can't, he said finally, closing the file. We don't have the capability, and even if we did, it would compromise the extraction. Richter is dangerous because he's competent and organized. If we move against him, the Nazis will increase security around all of their senior officers. It will make the extraction harder, not easier. But I heard the doubt in his voice, and I understood that what he'd chosen to believe, that survival is justified by results, was being tested against what his heart wanted him to do, which was vengeance. He was the one who authorized the executions, I said quietly. The 14 prisoners the radio operator mentioned. That was Richter's order. I saw the document in the resistance files. He signed it personally. Harrison closed his eyes. Then he'll face justice after the war. The Allies will put him on trial. There will be accountability. And how many more will he kill before that trial happens? I asked. He didn't answer. We both knew the answer. Richter would kill dozens more before the war ended. The machinery of Nazi occupation would continue grinding, and nothing we did would stop it. That evening, I made a choice that I kept from Harrison until it was too late to prevent it. I wrote a message in German, using coded language that would be understood by the underground networks, and I gave it to Petra to pass along through her connections. The message was simple. Klaus Richter would be attending a meeting at the Gestapo headquarters on the evening of November 15th. The building would be quiet, the guards distracted. An opportunity existed. I didn't name the opportunity. I didn't say that someone should assassinate him, but I made sure the message reached people who would understand exactly what I was suggesting, and who had both the capability and the motivation to act on it. When Harrison found out, and he did find out, because he was a military intelligence officer who knew how to read the signs, he was furious with me in a way I'd never seen before. "You just gave them a target," he said, his voice cold. "You created an operational plan. That's not justice, Clara. That's not even righteous vengeance. That's just passing the moral weight to someone else and pretending you didn't make a choice. Someone will kill Richter," I said, "whether I send that message or not. I'm simply making sure that the resistance gets the opportunity when he's most vulnerable. And if the mission goes wrong, if the Nazis crack down in response, if they execute more prisoners as retaliation, then that's on my conscience," I said. "I'll carry that weight, just like I carry the weight of the 14 people who died so that I could escape." He looked at me with something like heartbreak in his eyes. "That's when I knew you weren't going to be mine after the war," he said quietly. "That's when I understood that I'd fallen in love with someone who'd had to become something harder than I could ever become. And I realized that loving you meant accepting that you'd make choices I couldn't support, choices that would haunt me for the rest of my life." The British SOE extraction team consisted of 3 operatives and a forged German truck with papers that could pass cursory inspection but would never withstand serious scrutiny. They arrived at the rendezvous point, an abandoned mill about 3 kilometers from the safe house, at precisely 2 a.m., which meant that darkness was total and absolute. The lead operative was a woman named Eleanor, whose accent suggested Oxford education and whose efficiency suggested far more dangerous training. She barely acknowledged Harrison, focusing entirely on me, as if he were simply an inconvenient military escort. "You're the package," Eleanor said, examining my face in the dim light of a shielded lantern. "Intelligence files are accurate then. Czech national, early 30s, fluent in German and English, extensive resistance background. Welcome to the Underground Railway, Ms. Kovacs." "The package?" I repeated, a bit numbly. "Yes, well, dehumanization of cargo makes the work psychologically manageable," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "You're a package until you reach the safe terminal. Then you'll be debriefed and reassigned according to your potential and the current needs of Allied intelligence. Rather like a postal system, except that if you're lost in transit, the Nazis kill you instead of simply sending a bill. Despite everything, despite the danger, despite the moral weight of the choices I'd made, despite the love that was already fracturing between Harrison and me, I found myself appreciating Eleanor's dark humor. In war, gallows humor was sometimes the most honest thing available. The Underground Railway turned out to be exactly that, a network of safe houses, hidden routes, and trusted contacts that had been moving people south from occupied Europe for the better part of 3 years. Over the next 4 days, Harrison and I traveled through a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. We moved through villages where German soldiers still maintained checkpoints. We hid in barns and cellars, while military convoys passed overhead. We crossed rivers at points where the British SOE had already established relationships with local fishing guides who would ask no questions and receive compensation they would never be able to explain to their German overseers. At each stop, Eleanor gathered intelligence. She was not simply an extraction operative. She was a collector, someone gathering information about German movements, strength dispositions, and logistical capabilities. She incorporated this information into her intelligence reports, with the kind of casual competence that suggested she'd been doing this since before the war started. On the 3rd day of the journey, while we were hiding in a Catholic monastery in southern Moravia, the monks who sheltered us asked no questions, which I took to mean they'd been doing this long before Eleanor arrived. I finally had a real conversation with Eleanor about what I'd done. "The message you sent about Klaus Richter," Eleanor said. She wasn't asking a question. "Do you know what happened?" "No," I said. I deliberately chose not to know. The resistance members in Prague received it. They planned a careful operation. 3 members of the underground acted as liaisons between the safe houses and the Gestapo headquarters. They identified Richter's movements, confirmed his routine. They were planning to execute him on November 15th, just as your message suggested. "We're planning?" I asked carefully. The operation was compromised. One of the liaison members was arrested on November 12th. The Nazis are interrogating her now. She hasn't broken yet, but it's only a matter of time. When she does, the entire Prague cell will be exposed. I felt something inside me crumble, the weight of choices, compounding endlessly. My decision to send the message had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to deaths. That was the price of creating an opportunity. Will she break? I asked. Probably, Eleanor said. The Nazis are quite systematic about interrogation. They have pharmacological tools now, psychological techniques. Resistance training can hold against physical torture, but after a certain point, the human mind simply gives up. It's the nature of consciousness. Pain or drugs or extended sensory deprivation will eventually overwhelm even the strongest will. And how many more will die because of that? That depends on how many people she can name before she dies, Eleanor said coldly. Possibly a dozen. Possibly more. Possibly fewer. The uncertainty is part of what makes intelligence work so psychologically taxing. You make decisions with incomplete information, and then you spend the rest of your life wondering if you caused more harm than good. She stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Klaus Richter has authorized 17 execution orders since you sent the message. 7 of those executed were identified by interrogation of someone who was arrested, because they were part of the infrastructure that existed to move people like you to safety. So the cost-benefit analysis is ambiguous. You wanted to save lives by eliminating Richter. Instead, you created a cascade of consequences that killed people in order to attempt to prevent future kills by Richter. Whether that was the right choice depends on variables we can't measure and outcomes we can't predict. Which is precisely why moral decisions in wartime are always wrong, and why the only way to survive morally is to accept that wrongness and move forward anyway. That conversation changed something in me. Not my conviction that fighting back was right, that remained unchanged, but my understanding of what righteous resistance actually costs and who bears that cost became clearer and more terrible. When I finally told Harrison what had happened, what Eleanor had said, he held me while I wept, not in triumph or in vindication, but in the shared understanding that we were both participating in something that was necessary and wrong simultaneously. This is what the Nazis created, he said quietly. This is what occupation does. It forces good people to make decisions that will haunt them forever, and that's as much a victory for them, in a way, as actual military conquest. They break your conscience even before they break your body. How do you live with that? I asked. How do you live in a world where doing the right thing requires accepting that you've caused harm? You don't live with it, he said. You survive despite it. And you try to build something better afterward, something that makes the harm seem less pointless. Eleanor left us at a way station in a small village called Lubica, on the Slovakian side of the border. She'd been our guide for 4 days, and in that time, I'd developed a grudging respect for her and a genuine fear of her moral clarity. She was the kind of person who could make decisions that would destroy lesser people, and then move on to the next day's objectives without apparent internal struggle. You'll be picked up tomorrow at dawn, Eleanor said, giving us new papers. Your new identities are Italian refugees. Ms. Kovacs is now Maria Rossi, widow, traveling to join family in Switzerland. Commander Harrison is now Marco Rossi, my brother, recently discharged from military service due to a shoulder injury. The papers won't hold up to serious inspection, but they should suffice for the next leg. What happens after Switzerland? I asked. After Switzerland, you'll be handed off to OSS contacts, who will determine your assignment. Given your skills and background, I'd expect something in intelligence analysis, but the war situation is fluid, and plans change. Focus on reaching Switzerland first. Everything else is speculation. She was about to leave when Harrison stopped her. The woman in Prague, he said. The liaison member who was arrested. Will anyone try to extract her? To get her out before she breaks? Eleanor looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. No, she said simply. She's already dead, from a strategic perspective. If the Nazis haven't executed her yet, it's only because they believe they can get more information from her. Once she breaks, once she's given them everything, she'll be eliminated. Our only hope is that she holds long enough that we can evacuate everyone whose name she knows. The evacuation is happening now as we speak. By tomorrow morning, everyone in her cell except those who've already been compromised will be in motion toward extraction routes. That's barbaric, I said. That's war, Eleanor replied. And at least she's getting the possibility of evacuation. Most people caught in the occupation don't get that courtesy. She bought time for others to survive. That's more agency than most people get. After Eleanor left, Harrison and I spent a quiet evening in the safe house, another old stone cottage, this one owned by an elderly couple who'd survived occupation through the simple expedient of asking no questions and raising no voices. They provided us with dinner, bread, cheese, weak tea. They showed us to a bedroom that was almost comfortable. "I keep thinking about going back," Harrison said as we lay in the darkness. "I keep thinking about leaving you here and going back to Prague to do something about this, to stop it somehow." "You can't," I said. "And you know you can't. You're useful to me because you're useful to the Allies. The moment you go rogue, you become a liability. They'll catch you, court-martial you, and then they'll find someone else to help me. You don't save anything by sacrificing yourself." "But doing nothing saves anything?" he asked bitterly. "No," I said. "Doing nothing doesn't save anything either. We're doing what we can. We're extracting intelligence. We're moving information to people who can use it to end this war faster. That's not heroic, but it's real." The next morning brought a German checkpoint, which we'd been warned about, but which still sent adrenaline spiking through my system. The soldiers were perfunctory, barely glancing at our papers before waving us through. The irony was stark. We were moving safely through German territory using false papers, because the German military machine was already beginning to crack under the pressure of fighting on two fronts. But that perfunctory check also meant something else. The German army was overtaxed, overextended. The Nazis were losing the ability to maintain tight control over their occupation territories, and that meant opportunities were emerging. The vehicle that picked us up at a junction about 10 kilometers south of the way station was a commercial delivery truck, the kind that moved goods between legitimate businesses even during wartime. The driver was a Hungarian man named Victor, who spoke minimal English, but communicated through a combination of gestures and the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from having done this particular work for years. "Switzerland, 3 days," Victor said in heavily accented English. "Careful now. Germans losing discipline. Russians coming from east. Breakup happening. Dangerous time." That simple assessment was more accurate than any of the official military intelligence reports I'd heard. The war was in a state of fundamental rupture. The German military was no longer a unified force, but was fragmenting into regional commands, each responding to local pressures and deteriorating communications. The Soviet forces were pushing hard from the east. The Americans and British were pushing hard from the west. In the middle, civilian populations and occupation forces alike were caught in a period of transition that was arguably more dangerous than the stable occupation had been. And in that chaos, a terrible opportunity had emerged. Victor spoke in low tones as he drove, apparently needing to share what he'd heard. "Prague," he said. "Uprising, maybe. Resistance wants to liberate city before Russians come. Germans wants to prevent it. Fighting soon. Many dying." I felt Harrison stiffen beside me in the back of the truck. That uprising, if it happened, would be catastrophic. The Prague resistance was brave but relatively poorly armed. The Germans had armor and air support. Without outside help, the uprising would be slaughtered. But outside help was precisely what I was carrying. The intelligence in the documents I'd extracted included information about German military capability in the Prague region, about supply lines, about internal morale and unit cohesion. That information, properly analyzed and distributed, could potentially help the Allies decide to support the uprising with airstrikes or accelerated military movements. By leaving Prague, I'd created the possibility that the city would be liberated by Allied forces, but in doing so, I'd also ensured that the Germans would have time to prepare their defensive positions. I'd traded the spontaneous, immediate resistance of a local uprising for the systematic military capability of the Allies. Which choice would save more lives? Which choice would free Prague more completely? I still didn't know. I suspected I would spend the rest of my life not knowing. The checkpoint that stopped us on the road from Slovakia into Austria was manned by Wehrmacht soldiers who looked as tired and suspicious as any soldiers I'd ever encountered. They were young, most of them, barely 18, and they moved with the sluggish efficiency of troops who were no longer entirely confident that their government's cause was just. Victor produced papers that looked far more official than ours did. He was a licensed distributor with contracts to supply various military installations. The truck contained medical supplies and food products. Everything checked out on the surface. But the young officer who examined our papers seemed to sense that something was off. He was too alert, too focused. He asked questions that went beyond the standard script. Where we were from, where we were going, why we were traveling so close to the front lines. Refugees, Victor said simply. Running south, away from fighting, following contract obligations because contract is still valid. Nazis still need supplies. The officer studied our false papers with an intensity that made my heart rate accelerate. I felt Harrison's hand find mine in the darkness of the truck bed, a small gesture of connection in the face of potential disaster. "You're not refugees," the officer said finally, in perfect German. He was looking directly at me. "Refugees don't move like soldiers. They don't carry themselves like trained operatives. Who are you really?" I had perhaps 3 seconds to decide how to respond. "We could run." Victor had already placed his hand on the starter lever of the truck. "We could try to fight. We had handguns, though using them would eliminate any hope of continued concealment. Or we could tell the truth and hope that this young officer, this soldier who seemed to have already lost faith in his government's cause, was someone who could be reached through honesty. "We're people trying to survive," I said in German, matching his accent. "And yes, we're trained. And yes, we're operatives. But we're not your enemies. We're trying to end this war as quickly as possible, just like you should be." For a long moment, the officer studied my face. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between the orders he'd been given and the reality he was facing. I recognized it because I'd seen that same struggle in Harrison's eyes, and in my own when I looked in mirrors. "Papers are good," the officer said finally, "but I can see they're false. So, I'm going to let you pass, because I'm tired, and I'm tired of this war. And I think that whatever you're carrying that's important enough to risk this, it's probably worth me not reporting this checkpoint. Go. Go quickly, before I change my mind, or before someone else arrives who still believes in what we're doing." He waved us through, and Victor didn't waste any time accelerating away from the checkpoint. It wasn't until we'd put at least 5 kilometers between us and the checkpoint that anyone spoke. "He chose," Harrison said quietly. "That officer chose to let us go. He had the power to stop us, and he chose not to. He chose to stop being a Nazi," I said. "He chose to stop being willing to enforce the occupation. That's what collapsing authority looks like. Not in a dramatic moment of revolution, but in the quiet moment when someone decides that compliance is no longer necessary." The landscape changed as we moved south toward Switzerland. The mountains became more dramatic, less hospitable, more beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel, given the suffering that had defined the past few years. Victor drove with the kind of precision that suggested he'd made this journey dozens of times, skirting around larger towns, using back roads and forest passages that probably didn't appear on official maps. On our final evening before the border, we stopped at a small hamlet called Feldkirch, right on the Austrian side of the Swiss border. The safe house here was run by a woman named Greta, who was possibly a nun, or possibly something else entirely. She had the kind of ageless quality that comes from a life lived entirely outside normal social structures. "You understand what crossing means," Greta said to me in German, over dinner. It wasn't a question. "Switzerland is neutral. The moment you cross the border, you're beyond German jurisdiction. But you're also no longer under American military protection. You're in the custody of Swiss authorities, who will examine you as carefully as any government examines people attempting to enter their territory." "What about Commander Harrison?" I asked. "He can't cross," Greta said simply. "American military personnel attempting to cross into Switzerland would be interned as a potential security risk. The Swiss take their neutrality seriously, and that means detaining anyone who might compromise that neutrality." I felt the weight of this statement settle on me like stone. The journey had been leading to this moment, the moment when Harrison and I would have to separate. I'd known it intellectually, but knowing something intellectually is vastly different from experiencing it. "There's a way around it." Eleanor's voice came from the darkness beyond the kitchen. She emerged into the light, and I realized that she'd been in this safe house the entire time, waiting. "Commander Harrison can remain in Austria. There are American intelligence networks operating here that need military liaison. He'd be working in a quasi-official capacity, reporting to Colonel Stevens. Technically, he'd be violating the neutrality of Austria, but Austria is currently in occupied territory, so the violations are canceled out by prior violations. He'd be relatively safe, and more importantly, he'd be useful." "And then what?" I asked. "After the war? After the war, Austria will be a shared occupation zone between American, British, Soviet and French forces, Eleanor said. Commander Harrison's presence there as an intelligence officer would be both unremarkable and strategically valuable. Eventually, if the political situation allows, he could be transferred to Switzerland for reassignment, or he could remain in Austria to help organize the post-war administration. I looked at Harrison, and I could see the calculation playing across his face. Stay with me, and be separated from his country, his military, and everything he'd built his identity around. Or remain in Austria, continue to serve, and accept that our story together was ending. What do you want? He asked me quietly. I want everything, I said. I want you, and I want my family safe, and I want the war to end, and I want a world where people don't have to choose between their conscience and their survival. But since I can't have everything, I want you to do what matters. I want you to use the training and the capability you have to make sure that this war ends as quickly as possible, and that the peace that follows is built on something better than what came before. That's not an answer, he said. It is, I said. It's the only answer either of us can give. That night, we made love with the kind of intensity that comes from knowing this is the last time, not the final time. I believed then that we would see each other again after the war, when the world had reorganized and the structures of conflict had been replaced by whatever came next. But the last time in the intensity and immediacy of this moment, with danger still present and uncertainty still consuming the horizon. I told him stories about Prague before the occupation, about my father, who'd been a classical scholar, about my mother, who'd loved gardening and had maintained a small plot of vegetables even during the worst years of shortages, about my brother, whose fate I still didn't know. He told me about his dreams of what he'd become if the war had never happened. A concert pianist, perhaps, a professor of music and philosophy, someone whose life had been defined by beauty rather than by violence and difficult choices. We'll be those people, I said. After the war, we'll find each other again, and we'll be those people. We won't be the same people, he said. We're already changed. The war has already taken whatever we were before and made it into something else. Then we'll be different people, I said, but we'll be different together. I didn't believe it even then, but it needed to be said. The future had become too uncertain to predict, and the only way to face that uncertainty was to speak as if we had agency over what would come next. The border crossing happened at dawn. Victor drove us to a checkpoint, where Eleanor handed us off to a Swiss official, whose name we never learned. Greta and Eleanor vanished back into the safe house, their role in our journey concluded. Victor drove back toward Austria without a goodbye, his face impassive as he departed. The Swiss official examined our papers with a kind of clinical precision that was somehow more unsettling than German suspicion. He didn't ask questions. He simply read, analyzed, and made his determination. Your papers are adequate, he said finally in German. However, we maintain the right to conduct interviews regarding your immigration status and your planned activities within Switzerland. You will proceed to the processing center in Liechtenstein, where you will be debriefed. After that determination, you may be granted provisional asylum status, or may be required to return to Austrian territory. Is this understood? I said it was understood. I looked back at Harrison one final time before moving through the border gate. He was still in Austria, still in the occupation, still carrying the weight of choices we'd made together. Don't do anything noble, I called back to him in German, low enough that the official wouldn't hear. Survive. That's all you need to do. Survive and come find me when the war is over. I love you, he called back. I know, I said. That's the problem. The Swiss processing center wasn't a prison, but it had the systematic efficiency of an institution designed to categorize and contain. I spent 3 days in a small room being interviewed by different officials about my background, my activities in the resistance, my knowledge of German military positions in Czechoslovakia. I told them everything that mattered, and nothing that would compromise anyone still in the occupation. It was a balance I'd learned to strike through weeks of moving through dangerous territory. On the 3rd day, a different official, this one with the bearing of someone with actual intelligence authority, brought me information. We have confirmation, he said, that the Prague uprising began 4 days ago. It's ongoing, and it's fierce. The German military is responding with significant force. Civilian casualties are estimated at several thousand already, but the uprising is not being suppressed. In fact, it's becoming more organized. Soviet forces are advancing faster than anticipated, and American forces are accelerating their movement toward Czechoslovakia in response to the situation. And Prague? I asked. Is Prague going to be liberated? That depends on the pace of military operations, the official said. If Soviet forces reach the city within a week, they'll control it. If American forces reach it first, they'll control it. If the uprising continues for longer than that, there will likely be a negotiated handoff between American and Soviet commands. But Prague will be liberated. The occupation is ending. I wept when he told me this, and I didn't try to hide the tears. The weight of choices, the decision to extract myself, the message I'd sent about Richter, the chain of consequences that had followed, suddenly seemed less morally ambiguous. Lives had been lost because of my choices, but the war was ending. Prague was going to be free, and that meant my family had a chance at survival in a world that wasn't controlled by the Nazis. Eleanor found me 3 days later. She appeared in the processing center as if she'd been coordinating with the Swiss government all along, which, I suspect, she probably had been. "You're being transferred," she said, "to Switzerland proper, to a debriefing facility. From there, you'll likely be assigned to intelligence work for the remainder of the war. Your language skills and your understanding of Central European politics make you valuable. We have plans for you." "What about Commander Harrison?" I asked. "He's being transferred as well," Eleanor said, "to a different Austrian safe house, where he'll be working with OSS networks monitoring German military movements. After the war, when the occupation structures are in place, there are mechanisms in place for him to be reassigned to Switzerland if circumstances allow." "If circumstances allow," I repeated bitterly. "Which means probably not. Which means that the world will continue to operate according to forces beyond any individual's control," Eleanor corrected. "You've already learned this, Ms. Kovacs. You've already lived through the consequences of this truth. The only skill remaining for you to acquire is acceptance. Not resignation, but acceptance. The distinction matters." I was transferred to Bern 2 days later, where I was installed in a safe apartment and given access to intelligence analysis work. I was provided with the documents I'd extracted, now fully analyzed and integrated into Allied intelligence assessments, and I was asked to help interpret them, to explain the nuances of German strategy in Central Europe that only someone with my background could fully understand. The war continued for another 4 months after I crossed into Switzerland. During that time, I worked steadily, analyzing intelligence, writing reports, and gradually coming to understand that I'd become something new. Not a resistance fighter anymore, but an intelligence analyst. Not a refugee, but a valuable asset. The transformation was subtle but complete. In May, word arrived that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. I was allowed to listen to news broadcasts, and I heard about the liberation of Prague, the advance of Soviet forces through Czechoslovakia, the demarcation line between American and Soviet occupation zones that had been established at the Vlada River. And I heard nothing from Harrison. 3 months after the war ended, I was called to meet with a senior official from the OSS who was visiting the Bern station. His name was Colonel Stevens, the same Colonel Stevens who'd authorized my extraction and was presumably responsible for whatever had happened to Harrison. "Commander Harrison is alive," Stevens said immediately before I could ask. "He's in Vienna, working on the post-war intelligence assessment of former Nazi officials in the Austrian occupation zone. He's been promoted to major in recognition of his service. And he's requested transfer to Switzerland 3 times, each time being denied because his expertise is considered more valuable in Vienna." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I'm authorizing a transfer for you," Stevens said. "There are intelligence needs in Vienna that require someone with your specific background and language skills. You'll be working with Major Harrison, though of course you'll maintain separate reporting channels to avoid conflicts of interest. And you'll both be working within a framework that allows for eventual transfer back to Switzerland or reassignment as circumstances permit. In other words, you're not reuniting us," I said. "You're just placing us in the same geographic location and hoping we figure out the rest on our own." "In other words," Stevens said with a slight smile, "I'm operating within the constraints of institutional bureaucracy while trying to achieve a personal outcome that I believe is just and deserved. It's not perfect, but it's the best I can do within the system I'm working in." I arrived in Vienna in September 1945. The city was under joint Allied occupation, the damage from bombing and combat evident in every neighborhood. The rubble was being cleared slowly by displaced persons and POWs and German civilians who had no other choice. I found Harrison at a cafe near the River Danube, the same cafe where we'd agreed to meet if we ever both made it to Vienna. He was sitting alone at a small table, drinking coffee that probably didn't taste like real coffee, and reading a newspaper in German. When he looked up and saw me, I saw recognition cross his face, followed by something deeper, the acknowledgement of a transformation. We weren't the same people who'd parted at the Swiss border. The war had changed us both, and the question was whether those changes had taken us in compatible directions. He stood as I approached, and I saw that he moved differently than he had before, not with injury, but with the weight of everything he'd carried through the final months of the war and the first months of peace. "I heard you asked to be transferred 3 times, I said. "4 times, actually," he said, "but I'm no longer counting." "Are you going to kiss me?" I asked. "Or are we going to pretend that what happened between us was a temporary wartime arrangement that doesn't need to be resolved in peacetime?" He kissed me there in the cafe, with Viennese civilians watching and occupying American soldiers pretending not to notice, and it was both exactly like I remembered and completely different, because we were different, and the world we were kissing in was different. When he pulled away, he said something that Eleanor had taught me to understand over the months in Switzerland. We can't change what we did. We can't unmake the choices that saved us and destroyed others, but we can build something that makes those choices seem less arbitrary, something that suggests there was purpose to the suffering, if we're careful and deliberate about creating that purpose. "That's a terrible basis for a relationship," I said. "It's the only basis available to us," he replied, "and I'd rather build something real with you, something grounded in moral complexity and difficult choices, than pretend that either of us gets to live a simple life. We've both seen too much for simplicity." The epilogue to our story isn't dramatic. We weren't reunited for a fairy tale ending, because fairy tales are stories told about people who escaped complexity. We were 2 people who'd been shaped by war, and who were trying to figure out how to live in peace. Harrison eventually left military intelligence and became a professor of European history at the University of Vienna, where he taught about the Second World War with the kind of nuance that only someone who'd lived through it could provide. I continued working for American intelligence, eventually specializing in early Cold War analysis of Soviet intentions in Central Europe. We married in 1947, and we have tried, ever since, to live in a way that honors those who didn't survive. We sponsored displaced persons. We advocated for justice for war crimes. We worked to ensure that the post-war order would be built on something better than the pre-war order had been. We weren't heroes. We were simply people who'd made difficult choices and tried to live with the consequences. And perhaps that's the truest story of all. Not the dramatic narratives of war, but the patient, persistent work of trying to build a world that makes suffering seem not pointless but purposeful. Not justified, but acknowledged. I never found out if Klaus Richter was assassinated by the Prague resistance. I never confirmed whether the operation I'd helped set in motion had succeeded or failed, and perhaps that was for the best. Some choices are better left unconfirmed, their consequences measured only in the abstract weight they carry, rather than in specific outcomes that might validate or condemn them. The war ended. We survived. We found each other. We built something that mattered. It was enough. What aspects of Clara and James's story resonated most with you? Do you think their choices were justified, or do you see the moral complexity differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.